Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar entitled BA Toolkit, Top Visual Models for Complete Business Analysis. Today's featured speaker is Elizabeth Larson, PMP, CBAP, CSM, PBA, and is co-principal and CEO of Watermark Learning. Elizabeth has over 30 years of practical experience as both a PA and PM. Elizabeth's speaking history includes repeat presentations for national and international conferences on 5 continents. The webinar today will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and welcome everyone. Our objectives for today are, first of all, I want to talk about what I call the top visual models to use during business analysis, and these are the models that I have found most helpful in my career. I'm going to spend some time looking at how the models complement each other, how they work together, and the important relationship between elicitation and modeling. But first, I wonder if anyone else out there besides me is old enough to have used this tool. It's a little template. It was a plastic thing, and back in the dark ages, we used it for a lot. My first real job, my first full-time job, was as a management consultant, and I used this tool to document business processes. Later, when I became a systems analyst in an IT department, I used this for just about everything, from documenting interfaces among and between all the applications to designing our screens or user interfaces. The point is, back then, this was basically the only tool that we had. Nowadays, there are so many tools available to us, way more than I could possibly talk about today. So I'm just going to talk about the top models. Oh no, not these kinds of models. Actually, when I think about the visual models for business analysis, it's more like modeling clay than it is a fashion runway. And our models can be very simplistic, done with paper and pencil, or they can be more complex, done on sophisticated software, or anywhere in between. But here's the central theme of the presentation. Basically, if we want to end up with a solution or a piece or a part of the solution that our stakeholders and customers actually like to use, it's easy for them to use, they want to use it, well, then we need to get our requirements right. And if we want to get our requirements right, we have to ask the right questions. And if we want to ask the right questions, we need to model the requirements. So you want something good at the end, you need to do the modeling. But it's not easy. If you're new to this, modeling takes time. It's hard at first. I remember my struggles with doing data modeling. I'd never done it before. And I was at my desk minding my own business, happy in my job, when a recruiter called me. And he said, "Elizabeth, do I have a job for you?" And he described the job. He said what you would be doing would be facilitating data modeling sessions with business stakeholders, and then taking the results and working with the technical people to develop a database design. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "No, thank you." He said, "Please, it's easy. It sounds hard, but it's easy. Just come on in and talk to me." And so I went in and talked to him, and he took me over to this great big poster on a wall. And the name of the poster was 5 Rules of Data Normalization. And there were 5 different sets of pictures. So it was divided into 5 for each one of the normal rules of the rules of data normalization. And it had a farm motif of pigs and cows, barns and silos. What I remember about the poster is that I could read every word and knew what every word meant individually. I mean, I knew what rules were, I knew what data was. Normalization, isn't that what happens between countries, like they're normalizing relations? I understood each word individually, but I did not have the context. I couldn't put those words together. I didn't know what they meant. So it's hard, it takes time. Even some of the easier models are hard to learn. I mentioned that I was a management consultant, and I remember being in training. I was trained by one of the large 8 at the time accounting management consulting firms, and we were doing we called it flow charting, and it was a banking application, and I was following a teller and what the teller did. And somehow on my model, I ended up putting the teller in a wastebasket, and everyone just howled. They thought that was so funny. I never lived that down. And in addition, our models can get messy. Well, messy models takes us to facilitation tip number 1. And that is what we're talking about. My emphasis here is using modeling to get requirements. In other words, using modeling for elicitation, eliciting requirements. And I remember the first time I was facilitating a group of business stakeholders, and I had divided them into groups, and I had given them stickies for them to write down their process. And I collected the stickies, and behind me was this great big whiteboard. And I turned around, and I was putting the stickies on the whiteboard, and I remember that I didn't want to feel foolish. I wanted to make sure that my model used all the notation, that it was perfect. And so I wanted to make sure top to bottom, left to right, right notation. And when I had done that, I turned around, and it was really evident to me that the participants, I mean, they were gone. They were out of there. They were totally disengaged. So again, just to emphasize that during a session when we're getting requirements, let's focus on the requirements. Don't worry about how messy the model is. We can put it in the tool and make it very beautiful after. Okay, so models. What is a model? A model, of course, is a representation of reality, but how hard can it be? Isn't it just graphical representation and some text? Yes, it is. Well, okay, well, what's the benefit? Why should I spend the time doing modeling? Okay, remembering that models are a representation of reality. There are really 2 realities that we do need to worry about: the current state and the future state, the as is and the to be, if you will. And what this helps us understand is, what are the gaps and how do we get from today to tomorrow? What I love about models is that they take very complex ideas and concepts and get the information, kind of synthesize it, and so that we can present something to all different kinds of audiences and speak the same language, if you will, regardless of what our native tongues are. So to me, there's a huge benefit. And again, to me, one of the main benefits is it gives us the context for asking questions. It gives us structure for asking questions. It's a way of getting at questions that we probably wouldn't have thought about for quite some time. As a management consultant, I learned a lot of really great tips that have stood me in good stead my entire career. But I also learned some things that were not quite so helpful to me, and this is one of them. I remember being told, if you just ask the 5 W questions, the who, what, when, where, and why, and throw in a couple of H's, how and how often, you'll get all the requirements that you need. Well, yes, to some extent, that's true. If we have all the time in the world, we might get at what we actually need. But What modeling does for us is give us that structure, give us that context, and questions just kind of pop out at us. That it takes a lot longer if we stick to something like the who, what, when, where, and why. And I wish I could say, and those of us and you that have been doing this for a time know this, it would be great if we could just sit down, talk to people, do our modeling, and we're done. And of course, that doesn't happen. We have to do this iteratively. The important thing is that by asking the questions and doing the modeling, amazing questions jump out that we probably wouldn't have thought about. But how do we know which models to use? Do, know, use. How do we know which models to use? Again, do, know, use, do, know, use. Do are our process models. This is what people do. Know is the information that they need. Process models, again, what people do, these days is almost always supported by some kind of data. So we do a step and we have to input data, we get data back from our solution. The touch point between the data and the process, where they come together, where they interact, that's our use. And for me, one of the most useful interaction models is the use case. We're talking about that. And finally, our user interfaces are a graphical representation of the interaction models. And I'm going to say that again because I sure wish someone had told me this. It took me a while to discover it on my own, that user interfaces are a graphical representation of the interaction models. We have to do the work. Another central theme. Okay. Of course, we have our scope models. You know, how much of the process are we going to do in this part of the project? How much of the data do we need, et cetera. It's probably going to start out with your scope, but this is the big picture. But I often get asked, well, you know, where do I even begin? Or sometimes I'll get asked things like, well, you know, we don't do any modeling except prototyping. Is it okay if I just do the prototyping? And the answer is you can begin anywhere, you can leave out or do whatever you want to do. It's just that if you want to get at those questions, to get at the requirements, I absolutely recommend, even if you're doing a small piece, I recommend that you start with the business process. What data do you need to support the business process? How do people want to interact with our solution? And then the graphical representation. Now, I kind of like to do process and data at the same time and interaction and user interface at the same time. That's me. The point is for this webinar, my intention is absolutely not to get you to be able to create these models or even read these models, but to show that relationship between elicitation and modeling. So I'm going to start you off with about 5 questions for each of the models we're going to be going over, so that if this is something that's new to you, or if you have been doing this for years and years and years, you're either mentoring people or you have business stakeholders who have not been doing this for years and years and years. This is how we get going. So let's start with process. I'm going to be showing a very simplistic example of a swim lane diagram, which is kind of a process map. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page with what is a process. A process is a series of steps. Again, it's what people do. A series of steps that transform inputs into outputs and hopefully produces something of value at the end. Our outputs go to someone else. They become inputs for that someone else. They do the work, becomes output and go to someone else. So a series of steps transform inputs into outputs, outputs going to someone else. Hopefully they're valuable. So here's an example, as I said, very, very high level. Swimlane. I'm guessing that maybe 85 or 90% of you have created these, certainly worked with them, but for the few of you out there who may not be familiar with it, over on the left-hand side are the functions doing the steps, doing the work. The horizontal lines represent the swim lanes. And so what we can see, and again, I like to keep these at a high level, we can see the order entry, they transmit an order, that order goes to another area and goes to another area, etc. When I want the details, I will explode out the high-level processes. So we know that order entry transmits an order. That's just the name of a process, and we name our processes with a verb and a noun, transmit order. What does that mean, though? What's going on? Okay, I want to give you an example. Because I've been doing this my entire career, I sometimes forget that it's new for some people. And at Watermark, occasionally we do process mapping ourselves. And sometimes I'll get a deer in the headlight. And the example that I want to use, let's say that I'm working with our bookkeeper. And just for today, let's call him John. And we're going to go over the process to pay an invoice. So pay invoice. So I'll sit down with John. He's pretty scared about it anyhow. So I ask 5 questions. I'll ask him, John, before you get going, what do you have to have in your hot little hands, electronically, a piece of paper, whatever? What do you need before you can get going? That's your initial input. When we're all done, what is it that you produce? That's your final output. Then who is it? How do you get that initial input? That's the supplier. Where does the final output go? That's called a customer in some lingo. That gives us a framework. Some people will recognize that as the beginnings of a SIPOC chart. It gives us a framework for being able to look and focus on the process steps. My next question for John is, John, how do you typically or routinely go from the initial input to the final output? In other words, what is your happy path, no decisions, no exceptions? And he gives me such a look. And I say, John, I know you spend over 80% of your time on exceptions, so what we're going to do is list them out. We'll create what's sometimes called an exception parking lot. We're going to go over the routine first, no decisions, and then we'll add in each exception. We don't want to forget about them. And let me digress just for a moment for facilitation tip number 2. Why is it important not to go over the decisions here? People like me, I'm one of the worst, I admit, tend to get into the details, get into the weeds, and never come up for air. As a management consultant, the very first time I was ever sitting down with someone, he was a director, it was one-on-one, and I remember saying, Mike, you know, we're going to be doing this thing. What is the first step you do? What is the second step that you do? And I remember I felt so proud of myself that I could think of every exception. Well, what about this? And what about that? If this happens, what do you do? I mean, later on, I kind of thought of myself as, well, yeah, I was a really good prosecuting attorney, but we only got through 2 steps. So from a facilitation perspective, let's look at the big picture first, and then we can get into the detail. Okay, that was step number 3. Number 4, what are some other ways that you get from the input to the output, and what are some things that get in your way, and what is it that those exceptions that you spend so much time on? And throughout this whole process, I like the supporting statistics. How many, how often, what triggers this, the when, etc. So process models, I have found that business stakeholders love these. And I have found, in my experience, that most business stakeholders do a really good job of facilitating. Data models, not so much. They're not as fond of those. I had mentioned that it took me a while to learn data modeling. And once I did, boy, I was so excited. I really was. And about that time, I was put on a very large project, and I had a key stakeholder. She represented about 500 other people. And I sat down with her. I was so excited. I said, Sue, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about the data. Then we're going to be creating these entity relationship diagrams, an ERD. And I showed her one. And oh, the look on her face. She said, Elizabeth, I don't care what you do. Just don't show me any crow's feet. And this is what she was talking about. So here's the deal with data models. The information that we need to ask, well, what are the entities that you care about, and what are the attributes, and what about the intelligence that's built into the attributes, and what about the cardinality and optionality? Whoa, if we got up in front of a group of stakeholders and asked those questions, their eyes would glaze over, and we'd probably never be asked back again. But we need that information, but we need it in a way that they can answer. So here are the 5 questions that I like to ask and the way that I like to ask them. First, our entities. Well, what is the business information that you are most interested in? And I give some examples, like a customer, like an order. Then what are the facts about that information that we need to capture? These are the attributes. And then at some point, we get into defaults. We get into things that are called permitted or allowed values. And sometimes I get some strange looks about permitted values. So I say, let's talk about any types that you have. If it's an insurance company, like a type of insurance policy, perhaps an auto, perhaps a life insurance policy. And then we get into ranges of information. And then we get into, well, do the ranges have meaning, and what do all the numbers mean? And that's how we get the information. This stuff's easy. The entities, the attributes, we get those wrong, no problem. The hard are the relationships. These are the business rules, and we have to capture them. And it's really up to the business to make those rules, but we need to be trusted advisors. And if they're making a decision that's going to have an impact, we need to talk about what that impact is. So this is where we get into the cardinality and the optionality. I like to start with optionality, saying something like, well, let's talk about customers and orders. And can you set up a customer who doesn't have any orders? In other words, your definition of a customer, do they have to have placed an order or not? Right? Can a customer be a customer without placing an order? And so we also, once they say yes or no, or we say, okay, let's talk about purchase orders, because that's going to affect it. And so we, again, are trusted advisors. Well, that gets to the optionality. Then the cardinality. And I like to phrase it with minimums and maximums. Okay, for each customer, what is the minimum number of orders that they can place, including 0? What is the maximum number of orders? For each order, what are the minimum and maximum number of customers? Well, once we have all the information, we've gotten our entities and our attributes and our relationships, our business rules, we put it all together and we go back and make sure that they can confirm it, but in language that they can understand. So, for example, I'll say, Sue, this is what I thought I heard you say, that each customer can place any number of orders, but each order has to be placed by a single customer. Is that true? Is it false? And that gets our confirmation. Data models. The interaction, as I said, the touch point between our process models, our business process models, and our data models are the interaction, how people want to use the solution. And there are different kinds of interaction models. I want to go over a use case model that has 2 components. It has a use case diagram and use case narratives. And I'm guessing that, oh, I don't know, a high percentage of you are going, ugh. Okay, but anyhow, let's look at a use case model. I love the use case model. For me, it's my scope diagram. I just love it. So the questions, 5 questions to get us going with use case models. Question number 1, what is our solution or piece of the solution that we're working on? This is called a system. Question number 2, how do our stakeholders, who are our stakeholders, and which are the ones that are going to be interacting with our solution? Those are actors. And 2 things about actors, always, 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 they are always external to our system, to our solution, and they always interact directly with our system. We do not document actor-to-actor interactions like between a specialist and a customer. That's called a business process. Question number 3, how do all these actors, these stakeholders, want to use our solution? These are use cases. These are processes. We name them like any other process with a verb and a noun surrounded by a little oval. This is our functionality. This is why I love this for scope. So we have request item, reserve items and inventory, check items. Our use cases, how people want to use the system. Question number 4, what other systems or applications interface directly with ours? Any interfaces directly with our system, and it is an actor. And question number 5, how in the world do we get actors and the system to talk to each other? How do we get the actors to talk to the system to talk back to the actors? Through the use of interfaces. And if we're talking about a screen or user interface, that's a kind of interface. There might be audio interfaces. Again, when I look at this is work that has to be done. So another reason why I love it for scope. But I'm going to give you an example. I want to use the example, I always use this one, of my microwave being the system. So we're talking about my microwave. I need to tell my microwave what I want done. Do I want to heat up coffee? Do I want to cook a meal? And I do that with a little touchpad. That is the interface. Some people have a dial, a little knob that they turn. There's some kind of interface that allows me to tell my microwave what I want to do. And when I'm done, the microwave needs to tell me that it's done. It needs to talk back to me. I used to have a microwave. Boy, did it talk back to me. It wouldn't leave me alone. Beep, 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 beep. I mean, I had to pay it attention. Now I have a microwave that sings me a little tune. Seriously, it goes da, 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 da. And it's done. And then it shuts up. The point is this is real work that we need to consider. We need to think about it. And so it's how actors and the system talk to each other. So those are the 5 questions. The next step is to take each one of these are just process names. I mean, what does request items mean? What does reserve items and inventory do? We take each one of those and figure out through a narrative what's going on. And I can hear the rest of you, though you might have said ugh before, now you're saying, no way, I don't have time, I'm on an agile project, we don't do use cases, yeah, too much time. I'm going to take the example of reserve items and inventory and just walk through it with you. My point is, having worked on a lot of systems and applications long before there was such a thing as a use case, or long before we ever recognized that there was such a thing as a use case, we had to go through the mental work of figuring this stuff out. And believe me, it took a lot longer. Whether you're on an agile project or a traditional project or a hybrid project, you have to think about these things. Okay, so here are the 5 questions. Number 1, how do we know when we're ready to begin? We do that through what's called here a precondition. And again, I don't care what language you use, it's the concepts that are important to understand. So we have some preconditions. These are states, these are conditions, they're not actions that anyone takes. The actor is logged on, the system is available, and the line item page is displayed. We know exactly where we are. This is where we begin the use case. But how do we know when we're done? When is done done? Through our post conditions. And in this one, the item reserved message is displayed. When it's displayed, we are done. Question number 3, what is the most common routine way of getting from the pre to the post condition, from the beginning to the end? This is sometimes called the happy path. It has lots of other names, but happy path is pretty common. I like this little table with the actor action and the system response. And a couple of things to remember: we always, always, always start with the actor action, and we always, always end with the system response, and the last step in the system response takes us to the post condition. I display item reserve message, that's an action, takes us to that post condition. So I want to pause here and just say, again, regardless of the kind of project that you're working on, if you're working on an Agile project, many of you are going to be familiar with the given, when, then. You have to go through the thought process to figure that out. Here it is. Given precondition, when actor action, then system response. This gives us our acceptance criteria. This gives us our test scenarios. Okay, number 4, what are some different ways we can get from our pre to our post condition? I mean, we get to the post condition, we get to the end just in a different way. And then what are the things that prevent us from getting to the post condition? These are our exceptions. As we're working through these, we begin, a couple of things happen. Not only do we get our test scenarios that we can use, but we begin to think about edits and messages. And I think it's really hard to do these without starting to create our user interfaces. So we start putting pencil to paper for whatever, for our user interfaces as well. So those are the 5 questions. Our interface models are user interfaces. These can be, the model can be a prototype, a mock-up, a wireframe, even a storyboard. Our user interface prototypes can be very low tech, low fidelity, like this one, paper and pencil. And seriously, when I first learned to do prototyping, we're talking a long time ago, we did it with software. And someone in the organization suggested that we do it with paper and pencil. And I thought that was the silliest thing that I had ever heard. But it actually works really, really well when you're doing just a small piece and you're in the beginning. So it can be low fidelity, high fidelity, done on sophisticated software. And it's going to probably have some kind of combination of data and process. This one, this little paper and pencil thing I have here, is mainly data, because we have to enter data on a screen and then this system is going to display something back to us. So it's mainly data. Anytime we talk about screen navigation, that's process. And usually, as I said, we're going to have some combination of the data. How do the pieces of data look and feel, the look and feel on the screen, and how do we get from one to another? And so our questions. Now, here's the thing. If we've done our use cases, it's going to be really easy to know when this begins and when it ends. But if we haven't done that work, I was going to say, trust me, it just takes more time. You struggle, you just do. But you yourselves are going to have to decide, is it worth doing the use cases or not? And by the way, I didn't say this about the use cases, but if you want to use a different format and use different terminology, it's the concepts. It's the mental going through this and figuring out what you need. That's what's important, not what we call things. So where does it begin and end? And as I mentioned, screen navigation is process, the data is the look and feel. We're going to go over exceptions and messages as well. Scope models, I mentioned that I really like the use case diagrams. A lot of people like the context diagram. To me, again, it's the same thought process, it's just different terminology. But it is important, I know I'm going over this last, but it is important to figure out what piece of this are we doing. Particularly on a large project, you want to narrow it down. So whether you're actually calling it an iteration or a little piece, the scope models help us not just to see the big picture of the entire project, but of the individual pieces as well. This is one of my favorite slides because it shows how the models work together. It's just a summary of what we've talked about, and on it is a description of how we would use the models, as well as some questions to get you going. This slide talks about what I talked about before about the iterative elicitation and modeling, that we're going to do this iteratively, and as we go, we're going to get lower and lower levels of detail. So here are the 4 models. We're calling this the highest level being scope models, and you can see how they change as we get to the middle level. I'm calling that define, and how it changes again as we get into some detail. Well, that brings us almost to the end of the presentation, and warning, we have some corny, cute animal images ahead, so if you don't like to see cuddly cats and dogs, well, I don't know what you're going to do. Here we go. Please remember the do, know, use. I really, really wish, just like I wish someone had told me about the who, what, when, where, and why might be useful later on, not so much in the beginning. If someone had just given me this structure, this framework, for so many years, I could have gotten questions out there and answered so much sooner. Okay, we've talked about that relationship between elicitation and modeling. Remember, what I'm talking about here is using the models to get the requirements, not to end up with beautiful models. I talked about the importance of making sure that people understand what we're trying to do. We don't talk about cardinality and optionality. So we need to translate models into language that our business stakeholders are comfortable with. This one I didn't talk about, but I still like it. And that is choose models that make sense. If you're doing primarily process improvement, focus on the process and then the data to support the process. If you're doing predictive analytics, if you're doing AI, focus on the data primarily, as an example. And finally, I think it really is important to collaborate, not just with business stakeholders, not just with your technical partners, but with each other. I think this stuff is tough, and we all have so much to do, so little time, it's tough. If you can get another BA to help you out and you can help the other out, it really does make things so much easier and you end up with a better product. So that's it. And we're at the end of the official presentation, so we do have a lot of time for questions. I'm going to turn it back to Tracy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. I love the photos at the end. We're now going to begin answering the questions that were submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you still have time to type your questions into the questions box, and we'll pose them to Elizabeth. Our first question is from Raj, and he asks, don't we need requirements to begin modeling?
That's a wonderful question. So let me see if I can answer that pretty succinctly. Okay, so what are requirements, right? What are requirements? Requirements are a representation of the business need. I don't want to get into the difference between requirements and designs. That's in our body of knowledge. Think about their current state and future state representations of like what we need and what we're going to be doing. And they can take any form. They can be just verbiage like the system shall, ABC, or they can be just the models themselves. People use prototypes sometimes and hand those over to the technical people as requirements. So there's not just one way of doing the requirements. One more thing that I do want to add here, because I can understand how it can be a little confusing. That slide that I had that talked about the iterative elicitation modeling, we absolutely have to ask the questions. We have to document the responses, probably do that back and forth. And then we do the modeling, but they're all to get us the requirements that we need so that we can build some kind of a solution, whether it's an automated solution or another process or whatever. That's it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And just to let you know, you're getting some wonderful comments here on the question box.
Oh, good. Good, good. Thank you. Thank you. Like to see it at the end.
Our next question comes from Cyr. How can use case narratives be used to model system batch processes where there is no actor, comma, person?
Mm-hmm.
And is it the system that performs this action?
That is another really great question. I have taught and I've taught in organizations where they use cases for everything. And if you do that, that's okay. But that to me is a system process. To me, the use case, the power of the use case is that interaction. So yeah, you can use it for batch processes. I have no objection to that, but it does not then show the interaction. Usually, I mean, there might be, as you're doing a batch process, there might be some interaction, and the use case model would do that. But if you're looking at just the batch process itself, it's great. You have to document it someplace, but it's not a true use case per se.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Camilla. Before we start modeling the requirements, should we validate by the authorized stakeholders?
Oh, okay. I think I understand. In that the same chart that I have where I say we ask, we listen, we model, you can. So again, if you have requirements, I do want to emphasize that to some people, the model is the requirements. But if you have text and you want to validate that with the stakeholders, I see nothing wrong with that. And you could do it on the fly. You can get formal agreement. That's fine. What I don't think, and I don't know if there are any questions on this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say in this day and age where we really need to do things more agilely, more nimbly, coming up with a whole business requirements document, if you will. I just don't recommend it. You can, of course, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think I like asking questions, modeling, and then going back to the business stakeholders before I confirm. I just think we're going to get better questions. We're going to do it more quickly, more nimbly. That's my opinion. This is not to say that you can't do it the other way. After, again, having spent decades where we came up with a big BRD and yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, our next question. Is workflow and activity diagram similar?
There are different ways to document workflow. So I'm making a fine distinction here that workflow has a lot of different possible diagrams. An activity diagram might be one of them. Now, often with an activity diagram, particularly in unified modeling language, we're more documenting the system and what that does. You can use, from my perspective, you can use an activity diagram, a process map, a swimlane diagram, doesn't matter, to document the workflow. And the work being the work of business stakeholders or the system.
Okay, thanks. Our next question is from Amrut. When we work in complex projects such as data migration, will it not become too technical to model those requirements?
Well, if you are, okay, so let me pause and say another great question. Let me see if I can break down just a little bit. When you're migrating data, to me, you're migrating something that exists, that's already been collected. And this relates to predictive analytics and things like that. What I'm talking about is collecting the data. When you collect the data, you do the data modeling. But if you're migrating data, it's going to be, it could be messed up, could be incorrect, could be incomplete if you haven't modeled it. So if you're migrating from one to another, you need to make sure that what you're migrating from is correct, and the way you would do that is previously having done data models.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Ashley. I've come into a big web development project that didn't have a BA, only a PM for the first year.
Oh boy.
She's asking, how do I decide which models to create since there's a huge backlog?
I wonder if Ashley is what role she plays on that project. Let me say this, and I'm speaking from experience at Watermark Learning, where okay, you need to have a BA. I don't care what you call that person. If you want to call that person a PM, if you want to call him a developer, I don't care what you call that person. But if you don't have a BA, things will get missed.
Thank you. She's actually saying that she is a BA.
Okay, good. So for the web development, I still, boy, and I'm not sure if Ashley, if you're saying, can I skip any of the modeling? I still think we need to understand the business process. This is going to affect your customers, perhaps internal people. You still need the data. You can't do the web page without understanding the data, and you have to have that interaction. If I'm doing web design, I would definitely create personas to try and get into the heads of who's going to be interacting, who those actors are. But I don't see how you can skip any of it, honestly. I don't know if I answered. Or was the question? What do I do first? Could you read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly. Let me just pull that back up.
Okay.
How do I decide which models to create since there's a huge backlog?
Yeah, and I would absolutely do this actually with a piece. I wouldn't go back into all the business processes, all the data models. I will say, I have to say, because people tend to skip the data model if nothing else, that having a good, robust data model, because we know how to do this stuff at Watermark, has helped us. I can't even tell you how much, having a really good, robust data model. I would take a piece of it, but I still think, I still think all of that needs to be done. The work has to be done. You have customers out there using your web pages. You need the process. You need the interaction. So, sorry.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Emma. Why would you use a class diagram over an entity relationship diagram, or vice versa?
Yeah. These are like phenomenally great questions. For the class diagram, I've gone back and forth. When I first learned about class diagrams, and we're talking the 1990s perhaps, I kind of thought that in a way it's great because it has not just the entities but some processes, not just the data but some processes along with it. For me, you absolutely can use the class diagram. It's the same thing if you just look at the top part of it, just the data part of it. Same thing, just different language. Personally, I find it cleaner. Myself, my preference is ERD. You absolutely can use the class diagram. And as you're doing the data, just forget about the process below the line.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Vrashala. Is there any specific process model that will always work for eliciting requirements and understanding the business processes?
Again, I don't care what models you use, and I absolutely don't want to worry about notation. I'm going to be doing process modeling with my business stakeholders, and they don't care whether you're using some specific kind of notation or not. And as a matter of fact, the facilitation that I've done and that business stakeholders like product owners have done has been using generic symbols that are easy for them to understand. So I can't say that there's one that's better than another. Use what makes the most sense to your stakeholders. Now, if you've got some kind of a standard that you use in your organization, great. Once you have the process and everyone understands it, then go back and put it in the tool. But it really doesn't matter. I remember instead of using square boxes or rectangle boxes for some facilitation, we use circles because that's what our business stakeholder likes. So I would not worry about the notation at this point.
Excellent. Okay, our next question comes from Vera. What is your opinion on the most efficient way to check if all the requirements are covered in use cases?
That is a great question, and I'm going to admit that I haven't given a lot of thought to how do I know that all the requirements have been covered? If we do use cases in conjunction with our prototypes, we're going to drive out additional requirements. I mean, we just will. That's why you need all the models. There are times where we spend time on use cases. We thought we were being so thorough. We would put together our user interfaces, take it to some kind of a usability lab, and find out we had missed things. And that just happens. That's why we do this iteratively. So I don't have a very good answer for you on that one, and I'm sorry.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from CM. Which visual tool would you recommend for depicting the process or steps in a batch job?
Oh, I don't really, honestly, I don't know that it matters. I mean, I think that would be a good use of an activity diagram. You know, you could use, I don't know, and here, as I'm sure you probably know, that I'm talking about things that are generic models. I'm not talking about any particular software. I am software automated tool agnostic, if you will, or independent. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at with that question, or they're just, you know, I'm going to have to say I'm not sure that there's any one that's better or not. We have used just regular process maps in my past projects to depict batch processes. Again, you could use an activity diagram, so whatever works. I mean, the important thing is to document that process. That's going to be really important. I mean, it's an important part of your project, huge part of ours. But I don't know. I don't have a favorite tool for doing that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Jennifer. I'm still looking for definitions on iterative actions. What's the best resource to get an explanation?
I'm sorry, iterative, Tracy, one more, iterative actions?
So Jennifer's asking what's the best resource to get an explanation?
Oh boy, I would need to ask, Jennifer, are you talking about process or data? Are you talking about recursive relationships, or are you talking about steps that people do?
Let's give Jennifer, I'll just give, oh, she's saying process.
Okay. So process steps that are repeated need to be documented. I mean, there are lots of different ways we can document it. We can show business rules. We can, you know, you do this thing 3 times and then you get out or whatever. I don't know. There are a lot of good process books and resources that are out there. I think I would always start with our body of knowledge because I think that just takes things and makes them easy to understand. I'm talking about the process models and the elements and stuff. But Jennifer, are you talking about a step that is repeated X number of times before something else happens? And yeah, or are you just talking about a general resource for process modeling?
Let's just give her
okay.
Oh, Jennifer says, thank you. That was a great answer.
Oh, okay. Good. Thanks.
Excellent. So our next question comes from, oh, I've just lost it. Jason, how do you handle when the team is used to doing the design first before even defining the requirements? This way seems to force the team down a path to meet the design rather than solving the actual requirements.
The reason I'm hesitating is design and designs, that means different things. So there are lots of ways to interpret what you're saying. Our body of knowledge, the BABOK, business analysis body of knowledge, makes that distinction between a requirement and a design, but all of that is part of business analysis. From my perspective, I honestly don't care because my mind is pretty clear that this may not be technically correct, but I think of the requirements kind of like the as is and the designs is part of the to be. It's all, as I said, it's all part of business analysis. I don't care where you start. On this particular one, it doesn't matter to me. I think it could be design on up. I think it could be requirements on down. And even that distinction is fuzzy and getting fuzzier and fuzzier each day. As I mentioned before, my preference is not a lot of text. So if what you mean by requirements is doing a lot of text, not my favorite thing. But you could do it either way.
Thanks. Our next question from Eneth. Is it possible to use two models in modeling same requirements for more understanding for the stakeholders?
I think the answer is a definitive yes. And again, I can interpret that in a variety of different ways. Let's say we're doing process models. Could I do an activity diagram and a swim lane diagram? The answer is absolutely. You can combine the two. If the question is, can I do the process and the data or the process and the use case at the same time? Yeah, I do think that makes a lot of sense. So I think I'm thinking that either way, my answer is yes.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Our next question, what resource would you recommend to learn data modeling?
Oh boy. I'm hesitating. I'll tell you why I'm hesitating. I know it's old now, but we do have a book called Requirements Management, and that's an awful title these days. But we go into all the models and how you do it from a business analysis perspective. Oh, there's another resource that I really like, and that's Joy Beatty's visual modeling. She's great. I love her. So that's another good resource for you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think we have time for just one more question. Victor asks, how do you feel about event storming as a means of eliciting requirements? And do you see any potential pros and cons to this approach?
I think it's fine. I think, with every approach, there are some pros and cons, and there are a lot of external things that affect it. But yeah, no, I think it's a good approach. And yeah, so yeah, well, I think that is it. And I want to thank everyone. These were fabulous questions. Thank you for your participation and your comments. If you have any further questions, I will be happy to answer them. I'll probably put out a blog. If you have further questions, please feel free to contact me. You see my contact information. If you just want to get in touch with me at all, my contact information. And again, thank you so much.
And Elizabeth, thank you for such a great presentation today. We'd also like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at the ModernAnalyst.com website within a few business days. Thanks for coming today. This concludes our event, and I hope you have a great day.